overwhelmed by how amazing your visuals are. So what does that mean? That means we as designers have to, from the moment that we're crafting those systems, be thinking about how those systems deliver this visceral experience, deliver the final experience that the player is going to actually interact with. So let's do an exercise. All right, here's a track. Imagine this is a kart racing game, or a racing game in general. Now, I'm a designer, and I want to put some power-ups on this track. Where do I put them? All right, so a bunch of you guys probably have an answer for me, but we're skipping a step. We're skipping that all-important moment where we ask why. What experience are we trying to create for the player? Because you know what? If I want to make the player feel powerful, I put them here. I put them on the straightaways where there isn't anything for the player to do, right? This area, it's easy to control the car, there's not much there, you grab that power up, you speed down the track, you feel really good. But if I'm trying to create challenge, if I'm building out a risk-reward moment, I put them here, on the curves. What experience I am trying to create determines what the correct position for those power-ups are. If I don't know that going in, I don't know if I'm building the right experience. And equally importantly, I can't test if my design works. I have no way of knowing if this is doing what I want it to do if I don't go in knowing what I want it to do. So it's always important to start from the position of the experience you're trying to create for a human being. So with that, let's talk about what it means to meet the player's needs. This pyramid is to me a hierarchy of quality, right? Really great games do everything on here, but the player cannot experience something higher up on this list unless you've done everything below. So let's talk first about understanding the basic elements of play. Obviously, when your game begins, you need to get the player to the point where they feel comfortable exploring and learning and pushing into your game on their own, right? This is where your tutorial comes in, this is where your UI, UX comes in. But more than that, when we get to that UI, UX, you need a good user interface. You need a good user experience. Why? Because if you do not have this, the player is not going to be immersed in your game. Every time, and we've all had this in games, you're fighting against the UI, every time that you find yourself pushing back against some awkward piece of menu or what have you, it reminds you you're playing a game, and you can't get lost in the experience that you want to be having. Which leads us to the satisfying visual experience, because if your UI is bad, you cannot get here. The first of the psychological needs is a satisfying visceral experience. Your music, your visuals, your gameplay, they all have to fit together. They have to mesh in order to make a single unified experience. And we're going to talk about this more in the next talk. But if you can deliver that, then the next part is your core fantasy, because this is one of the key parts of design. You as a designer have to deliver on a core fantasy that the player is really coming to your game for. What is a core fantasy? Well, really, it's the emotive need. It's the thing the person wants on an emotional level to get out of your game. Now, that may sound silly, but you always need to ask yourself, is my game trying to make people feel heroic? Is it trying to make them feel sad? Is it trying to make them feel smart and clever? Is it trying to make them feel relaxed? These are all very different games, and you have to know which one you're doing. And sometimes on a surface level, two games can look very similar and deliver very different core experiences, core fantasies. And if you don't know the right one, if you're not focused on it, you're never going to get to the point of self-fulfillment. Self-fulfillment is where you leave the player with something to take with them when they finish our game. What do I mean by that? Or not even finish our game, but play our game, right? This can be a story that really impacts somebody, or a friend they made in an MMO, or, I mean, many of you have probably, whether it's in school or at work, have gone out and told somebody about a cool experience you had in a game. That is the player engaging with your game while they're not playing it. You take up space in their mind. Your game is still there, even when they can't actually be pressing a button or looking at a screen. And that's what we're going to keep people coming back. That's what makes franchises. That's what we're aiming to do. But we can't do any of that without hitting all these other points. So, let's talk about the second three principles, because as a designer, we have a job. And our job is to craft the best possible game. Not the best imaginable game. That is something different, and that's something that new designers often go for. No, we are looking to do the best possible game. So we have to ask ourselves, what resources do we have available that we can utilize to craft an ever better game, right? And this comes in three parts: your tech, your team, and your timeline. So let's talk tech. This is sort of the question of what have you guys built out, or what can your engineers do that's going to allow you to craft an experience that nobody's ever seen before. Portal. This is a great example, right? This team built a game called Nervacular Drop. They had this portal tech, and they crafted a whole game around it, right? The design of this game is built around this idea of, oh, we have a piece of tech that can deliver an experience that nobody has ever seen before. That is what's going to be your unique selling point. That is what's going to get you noticed without having to drop enormous amounts on advertising. Another good example, Pokemon Go, right? Niantic had from Ingress the databases, the tech to do this. And they were like, okay, what experience can we really craft around that? What's unique on a technical side that we can deliver on that nobody else can? So that way, anyone who wants that experience has to come to us, Pokemon Go. And then you have to talk about your team, because if you have a ton of artists and not a lot of engineers, you don't want to make a game that's going to require a complicated physics system or some piece of tech that, is going to take a long time to build. And as a designer, you want to focus on the strengths of your team. So in that case, you'd want to highlight the art. The people doing Sky, this whole game is built around a team who is very good at emotive social interactions, right? This sort of game, you can look at Journey and see where it came from. But this entire thing, they took their team into consideration and built this experience around it, and it became very successful. Same thing, going the other direction with League of Legends. League of Legends was a game where they knew what their core design was, so they actively hired people who were very experienced with Dota in order to be able to communicate more easily, so everyone would be on the same page as they were building their game, so they could be more efficient about how they crafted the game itself. Finally, we need to talk about our timeline, because if you don't have a big budget, if you don't have a lot of time to build your game, you can still build a great game, right? Survivor games are what this is all about. What do these games have in common? They reuse assets, they're highly replayable, and they're all about the systems, right? This doesn't take a lot of content to build this game. If your game, to understand why it's good, if your player is going to need to see a lot of content, if you're going to have to build out a lot of things, it's not what we should be designing for if we don't have the budget to do it, right? Don't build The Witcher if you have $100,000. So, this last point that I want to bring up for everybody is this idea of failing faster, because this is the designer's credo. As designers, no idea is going to spring fully formed and perfectly right from your head. It's never going to happen. I wish it would. I certainly haven't experienced. You guys probably better than me. But, so what do you need to do? Well, you need to iterate. As a designer, our job is to make sure that, it's fine being wrong, but we can't stay wrong. Our job is to make sure that we don't stay going down the wrong path. So what does that mean? We need to find ways to iterate as soon as humanly possible. As a designer, I start with an idea, I bring it to my design team. We start tearing it apart. It's first stage of iteration. Then we'll go write a design doc for it, and I'll sleep on it for a night. Then, I'm good at self-delusion, so I pretend someone else wrote it and handed it to me for review, and I'm like, this is stupid, this idea is terrible, all this stuff. And again, before we have a single engineer, before we're paying an artist on the project, we are iterating. Then I take that idea and I go to the other teams, I go to the artists, I go to the programmers and ask, hey, what's the worst thing here? What's the hardest thing for you? Why? Because I want them to not be polite to me, I want them to tell me the truth. Because that is going to tell me a lot that I need to redline or change to make the production flow. And then finally after that, we start, doing our actual gray box prototype. and get it out to people as soon as we can. The faster you have other eyes on it, the faster you have people telling you what's bad, the faster you'll get to good. So remember, fail faster. All right, so in a slightly awkward transition, I am also the next stock. So at least I don't have to reintroduce myself. Let's talk about the first 5 minutes of your game, because this is, are you coming up to actually reintroduce me? No, okay, I'm just gonna embarrass you over there. All right, so let's talk about the first 5 minutes of your game, or how to stop your player from bouncing off, because the first 5 minutes, especially mobile, are the most important. 80% of your players choose whether or not they're going to continue in your game in those first 5 minutes. So we've got to make them great. How do we do that? Well, here are the 4 pillars of your first 5 minutes of play. First, you need to prepare the player subconsciously and emotionally to have the best experience possible with your game. Next, you need to show them the promise of your game. You need to show them why it's going to be good 20 hours down the line in those first 5 minutes. After that, we have to get them to practice the game. We as designers need to get the player to understand how to play our game, so when we stop holding their hand, they're perfectly capable of exploring this world and enjoying the experience we've created for them. And then finally, we have to deliver the payoff. We have to make sure that we've rewarded the player for sticking around and incentivize them to come back the next time. So with that, let's talk about preparing your player. I'm going to talk about Genshin Impact, because how many of you guys have played Genshin Impact? Just raise your hands. All right, fair number, you great. So just take a moment and listen to this music. How does this make you feel? Does it make you feel pumped up? No, it makes you feel at peace. It feels, relaxing and restful. Why? What are they doing here? What type of game? What is the core experience, the core fantasy that people want out of Genshin Impact? In this particular case, Genshin is not Diablo. It is not Devil May Cry. Can we drop the music just a tear? Thank you. Basically, in Genshin Impact, what they're selling to the player is a relaxing other world for you to step into when, this one's a little too much, a little too heavy. Another place to be that's more magical than the world you're existing in. And so what do? They start off by giving you this peaceful music. You're floating through the clouds. At the very end, when they load the game, this is genius, they literally open a door to another world for you. Why? Because they're preparing you emotionally and subconsciously to have the best possible experience with their game. If you came in seeing the word action RPG on this game and you were expecting God of War, you're going to be disappointed. But by the time that you're through that door, your expectations have been changed, at least on a subconscious level. And imagine if instead, this was Genshin Impact starting music, right? Awesome. Oh, I see some people waking up in the back. That's great. This is a total disc jump, right? This is going to give you an impression of a different experience that they're actually going to deliver. And when you get into this game, you're going to be disappointed because they set your expectations differently. So when you're thinking about those first 5 minutes, think about how you can set the player's expectation for the game you're going to deliver. Because as we're doing this, we've got a couple of commandments. When you're trying to figure out how to set those expectations, the first thing is to just keep it short. You'll notice in that example that they're using space, which is going to have to be there, that sort of throwaway space, right? Use your landing screen. Use your loading screen. Use that cutscene that you're going to throw in the beginning anyway. Make sure it's delivering and preparing the player for the experience they want, right? Any of you who are fans of Final Fantasy games, that Amano art, that stark, minimalist loading screen, and that Uematsu theme, that's all there to get you ready for this slower, more story-driven RPG experience. So use that. Don't just build those. Think about what you're building. Next, you're going to have to know your player, right? Think about who is playing this game and what's going to be most effective for them. Are they more influenced by music or visuals? You're going to try and use all of it, but target your player with this. And then finally, know your game. What mood or feeling are you trying to achieve with this game? Because, let's take match 3 games, right? Some match 3 games are about relaxing. They're just about sitting back and matching some colors. Other match 3 games are about feeling clever. They're about puzzles, about making you feel like, oh, I'm smart for doing this. Those are different games, radically different games. And if you don't realize that, they look very similar, but the way you're prepping your player is going to be very different for those 2 experiences. So make sure you know your game and the core fantasy you're delivering on. If you can achieve all that, you've got your player predisposed to like your game. And that's what you want to do before they ever enter and start playing. So next, let's talk about showing them the promise of your game. What do I mean by this? This is the time at the very start, in those first 5 minutes, where you have to answer an incredibly difficult problem. In those first 5 minutes, when the player doesn't know how to play, when they haven't invested the time to get the cool gear or the impressive skills, you have to show them why your game is going to be amazing if they stick around for 20 hours. Because if you don't show them that, if you don't promise them something for staying in that game, if you don't show them that this experience is going to be worth it, they have lots of other games to go to. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look at Zelda, right? This plateau, genius. The whole beginning of the game, as they're teaching the player how to play, what's happening? Everywhere in the background, you can see what you're going to get to do if you just stick with it, right? That castle, I want to go to that castle. This volcano back here, man, it's going to be cool when I finally get there. That's what you want to deliver on in those first 5 minutes. Or, for example, right, let's take Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is one of those games where, honestly, beginning is boring. You got some uninteresting characters fighting some uninteresting orcs forever. So what do they need to do to get the player to continue to play that game? Well, in the case of Raid Shadow Legends, they identified exactly what the experience is that players wanted. They wanted this epic RPG experience with, all these magical, powerful characters, and they wanted to fight a dragon. So what do? They give players those max level characters with all these cool abilities, and they walk them through, they make it very easy for them to use those abilities. And as they're sort of progressing through the tutorial, they're doing all this flashy stuff, they're showing off the coolest abilities in the game, they've got all this awesome armor on, and then finally they get to that dragon, and they fight this dragon, and that's the experience that the player's really there for, they really want. And then after that, you can't beat the dragon. You get sort of smashed, and you lose these characters, right? They do a quick narrative hand wave, and they're like, oh, well, this was forever ago. These characters sealed away. Now you have to start your journey. But because they've shown you that, because you now know what you're going to get to do if you stick with it, if you hang out with them for the next, 100 hours and $200, you're going to have that experience. And so you do. You get past that initial grind. Next, we got to make the player practice. And the problem is I see a lot of people build out tutorials that are text boxes, that are chores, right? If the player feels like they're doing homework in your first 5 minutes to learn your game, they're going to leave because that's not an engaging experience. And people want to be engaged right away. So let's walk through Mario 1-1. You all recognize this? All right, some of you do. Great. So we as designers, when we start building out a tutorial, have to ask ourselves a group of questions. What does the player absolutely need to know? What order do they need to know it in? When do they need to know it by? And then we have to take the player and make them do these things. We can't just tell them, because telling somebody something, much less effective in terms of retention than doing it themselves. And then finally, we have to make them feel really good and successful for learning something that might actually be very simple. So how do we do this? Well, let's talk about Mario 1-1, because Miyamoto does this without ever putting a word on the screen. All right, take a look at this. Where does the player start on this screen? They start over here, on the left. Why? Because if you start all the way on the left, that means you're supposed to go right. This entire game, all Mario is going right. That's the whole game. And you know that from that very first screen. What else do we notice about the screen? Nothing. There's nothing there, so you feel safe. You can press the buttons, mess around a little bit to figure out how you're supposed to play the game and what everything does. And once you're there, after a few seconds, we get to this screen. And you've gone right, and wait, there's that weird block up there. Why? Why are there all of these question mark blocks flashing, showing us, oh, this is something maybe I should interact with? Well, they're all above you, right? What's the next thing he needs to know you can do as a player? Miyamoto needs to know that you can jump. That's the next big principle he needs to teach you. So he's got all this stuff up here to encourage you to jump, because if something's up that high, it's not just there by accident. You want to see what it is. You want to see what's there. So one of these buttons is going to get you to jump. And if none of them does, what's the point of this guy? Well, if you don't know how to jump yet, this guy's going to kill you before you get any further. So by the time you're past this Goomba, 100% Miyamoto knows absolutely every player knows how to jump in his game. And he has this cool moment where, if you jump and you're messing around with it, he rewards you, right? You hit this block and you can't miss this mushroom, right? It hits this pipe and goes back. So now let's talk about this pipe itself, because how high is this pipe? The height of this pipe is exactly your jump height. So if you do a basic jump, he knows, again, we've had you do this thing, we know you've repeated it. Since you repeat it, he knows not only can you jump, but you didn't just accidentally jump. You know how to do it. So then, we get this space. What's in this space? Nothing, right? Another safe space to mess around for the next thing he needs to test out on. What do you think this is, right? In your mind, why is this height? So this is if you press and hold to jump. This is how high you jump. He needs to know that you know how to do the extended jump. So we put a pipe of exactly that height. By the time you get over this, he knows you know how to do that. And then, what's this? Well, this is the running jump. So now, by the time you pass these 3 pipes, which takes 15 seconds, he knows that you know how to run, you know how to jump, you know how to do the extended jump, and you know how to do a running jump, which are the 3 basic elements of the game, and then he ties that all together with the fact that he knows that you want to just keep going right. So, what's this area? This is the practice area. He's had you run and jump. Now he's going to put a little bit of threat there and give you a second time to practice running and jumping, so he knows you didn't do it by accident. He's had you do it twice. That means you can actually do it. And so without a single word of text, once again, he's gotten you everything. But there's still this last bit. This pit is the final test. Can you get across this? Because this is the demarcation line between the tutorial and the game itself. And what's really interesting, what's really neat about this pit is it's not too hard to get over. But if a player doesn't yet feel comfortable, if they don't know the exact distance of the jump, they're going to hit this invisible block, and a 1-up's going to pop out, and they're going to feel really good. They're not going to just fall in the pit and die. Instead, they get rewarded. So you don't make them feel like a failure. You make them feel like a success for getting through this. And what's amazing about this is, for a new player, you might spend 20, 30 seconds doing this, right? Because you've never done it before. But for an experienced veteran player, without having a skip button on the tutorial, because no one can ever skip it, without having a skip button on the tutorial, this takes like 5 seconds to blaze through for anyone who knows what they're doing. So they can manually sort of skip it. It adjusts to how well they know the game. Nobody's quitting the game on this tutorial. Which leads us to the last point, payoff. When your player is finishing with your tutorial, you need to reward them. Both at the end of the tutorial and at the end of the first play session. What do I mean by reward? Well, it can be like loot and gear or currency, but there's a lot of other things it can be, right? You can reward the player with mystery, with a narrative moment where like, oh, I want to figure out what happens next, and that's going to drive them into the next play session. You can reward the player by opening up new mechanics, all this cool new stuff to play with that, oh, next time I jump in, I'm going to get you all this stuff and play with all these new toys. That's awesome. That's a reward for the player. Or you can even reward the player with a big moment, right? You can give them that moment where, boom, they blow up all the candies, get 10 million points, it feels really good, and they want to have that experience again, and they know they're going to get to in your game if they keep playing. So, overall, let's remember that you want to reward your player at the end of the tutorial. You want to reward them for having gotten through the part that's kind of a chore. After that, we want to make sure we reward them before their first play session ends. Check your metrics. Play test. Know when your average player stops playing your game, because sometimes it's at the end of the tutorial that they stop their first play session. But a lot of times it's not, and you want to reward them there too. And then, right, remember that we don't only have to reward them with currency. Currency's a little boring. Reward them with narrative, reward them with items, reward them with new mechanics so they have something to come back to rather than just some currency, which maybe is not even enough currency to buy a loot box or whatever they want to spend it on. And then finally, let's remember that we can cheat a little bit for our players. Don't be afraid to. If you're rewarding them with items or you're giving them a loot box at the end of this or whatever, tweak the odds a little bit. Give them that ultra rare, because what you want to do is have them feel like, oh, I got this cool thing, I should come back to play with it. Or, oh man, I don't want to just quit because I got this really awesome item. Make sure it's not so awesome that the next, 10 hours of your game are super boring because it's too powerful. But overall, cheat for your player. Make sure that you're rewarding them in a meaningful way that gives them something that they're excited to return to. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or comments, we're going to do a QA later, and you're welcome to hit me up on LinkedIn and ask anything you want.